Welcome to San Diego Miramar College if this is your first time visiting with us, and if not, welcome back to the Fall 25 semester. Is it Fall 25? Okay. I'm like, oh, I can't remember anymore. Before we get started, I do want to read our land acknowledgement for Miramar College. We recognize that San Diego Miramar College sits on the ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay people, who have lived in this area for well over 10,000 years. And we honor their past, present, and future connection to this land and its inherent connection to their identity. We acknowledge our occupation of unceded Kumeyaay land and the violent systemic injustices this has continuously perpetuated for Native peoples of this region. We pay respect to the indigenous people of San Diego County, past, present, and future, and honor their continuing presence in their homeland and their spiritual beliefs that land does not belong to people, people belong to land. We also acknowledge that this is merely the beginning and there is far more work to be done in an attempt to heal all the injustices and inequities that still exist today and throughout their entire historical diaspora. We commit to moving forward together. I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker today. Tim Wise is a leading anti-racist writer and educator in the United States with over 25 years of experience speaking at various venues, including colleges and high school campuses and conferences like NCORE, if you've attended, and community groups nationwide. He has provided anti-racism training to professionals in corporate, government, entertainment, media, law enforcement, military, and medical industries, both in the US and internationally. As an author of 9 books, including Dispatches from the Race War, Wise explores topics such as racial inequity, privilege, and the impact of racism on society. He has been recognized as one of 25 visionaries who are changing the world by Whitney Reader and has contributed to numerous books and journals. Wise's work is widely taught in colleges and universities across the nation. His involvement in social justice extends to his advisory role at the Fisk University Race Relations Institute and his past work with the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism. He has also been featured in documentaries including White Like Me and The Great White Hoax, and has participated in public dialogues on issues of race, class, gender, and militarism. Regularly appearing on CNN, MSNBC, Wise is a sought-after commentator on race-related issues. He graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racist training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Wise also hosts the podcast Speak Out with Tim Wise. It's my honor to welcome Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. I appreciate y'all coming out, and it's good to be back at Miramar. I was here some time ago. I couldn't tell you when that was exactly, but I was here. I've had a couple days here in San Diego enjoying, or not so much enjoying, this not so great San Diego weather that you're having. I feel I brought the humidity and the heat with me from Tennessee, so I apologize for that. Speaking of being from Tennessee, I do want to suggest if there are any of you who know how I can get political asylum out here, you might want to tell me how to do that, because I come from a place where most of the things that I'm about to say are essentially illegalized, in that I'm not allowed to talk about the issues of racial injustice, diversity, equity, inequity in about 25 states in this country, including my own, on college campuses or K-12 school campuses, or in a lot of corporate settings or government settings, because the legislatures of those states, including my own, have seen fit to suggest that apparently folks are not adult enough to handle those conversations, and it's going to make certain people feel bad if we have those conversations. It's going to insult white people, apparently, if we talk about the issue of white supremacy in America historically or today. And so it's good to be in a place where I'm still allowed, at least for now, to talk about those things. And so I will try to do so, and then I will take some questions in the time that we'll have once I am done with that. We are right now, and I suspect you know this, but it bears repeating, that we are at a critical juncture in the history of our country. We are undergoing currently an assault, and I mean this very literally, on the last 60 to 70 years or so of civil rights progress in America. And perhaps even more than that. In some ways, we are facing a group of people at the head of government who seek to repeal most of the 20th century. Not just with regard to issues of racial justice and civil rights, but also with regard to the rights of working people to organize, the right to keep children out of having to work at the age of 14 and 30. Apparently in Arkansas, they don't think we need to ban child labor anymore, right? So we're talking about an assault on everything from the minimum wage and the rights of workers to the rights of black and brown folks to the rights of women to the rights of LGBTQ folks. It is an all-out assault on just about everything we've come to take for granted in this country in the last 6 or 7 decades. The President of the United States has issued multiple executive orders that actually repeal former anti-discrimination orders that had been in place since the mid-1960s. His Department of Education has dropped virtually every lawsuit against a school district in this country that was being sued because of anti-black racism or anti-brown racism, and instead has decided either to shelve those cases or drop them altogether, slow walk them through the courts while turning his attention to supposed anti-white racism, which of course as a white person of 57 years myself, I can tell you, really big problem apparently is what we're being told. That is the injustice in America, that people like me are the ones who are under attack. And so that's what the Department of Education is suggesting in terms of their priorities. We have masked secret police that are literally snatching people off the streets of this country, unwilling to identify themselves, unwilling to carry badges, unwilling to wear uniforms, unwilling to procure search warrants before they do any of this, and all of it is being accepted. All of it is being accepted and shrugged off, mostly by the media, by politicians, by commentators, and average everyday citizens who apparently think that it is normal to have secret police marauding around the country, racially profiling brown folk, suspected of being here without appropriate papers, whether or not that is actually true. We have a military occupation taking place in the nation's capital and threats of more of that, but only in certain cities and only in certain states. The president is suggesting that he has the right to send the military into Chicago, into Los Angeles, into any other city he deems appropriate. He believes this because he has bad legal advice and cannot read the Constitution, but he insists upon it, that he has the right to do that to supposedly stop crime, ignoring, of course, that the crime rates in Chicago, the crime rates in DC, the crime rates in Los Angeles are considerably lower than the crime rates in several places he hasn't threatened to send the military. And I wonder what the difference might be between these places. Here are a few places that have higher crime rates than Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, DC, San Francisco. They are Anchorage, Alaska, Springfield, Missouri, Jacksonville, Florida, and Rapid City, South Dakota. There's actually several more, but I'll just leave it at those four. And you may say, how can that be? We don't hear about a crime wave in Anchorage, Alaska. No, you don't. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. They have the highest per capita homicide rate in the United States. Now, I'm not saying they have as many violent crimes as exist in larger cities, but the per capita crime rate is higher, considerably higher, and that's the only data that matters if you're worried about being a victim, right? Because the crime rate is what tells us what the odds are that you will actually be victimized by violent crime. So if this were about crime, we would be sending the military into Anchorage and into Rapid City and into Jacksonville and into Springfield, Missouri, but we won't because those are mostly white places and they have white mayors. And in those particular cases, they are in so-called red states, all of which, by the way, or the vast majority of which have higher crime rates than blue states. So I will leave it to your imagination as to why we aren't talking about the crime wave in the places that voted for the current president of the United States. That's what we're facing right now. We have an administration that is seeking to end all diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And not just those efforts in schools and in the workplace and in government, but by actually removing any individual of color they can find that has a position of authority that they think doesn't deserve it. And so the president has removed Lloyd Austin, the former Secretary of Defense, a decorated veteran with immense qualifications, but he was referred to as a DEI hire by the current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, whose prior job was being a news host on Fox. Right? So we replaced a supposed DEI hire with Pete Hegseth, who I guess is a DUI hire, if you understand his history. Right? But supposedly doing that in the name of merit and qualifications and getting rid of unqualified people. We also got rid of CQ Brown, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Again, a highly decorated and honored veteran, replaced him with a white guy with far fewer qualifications who the president decided to put in there because he liked his nickname. Literally, that's the reason that he wanted the current head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because his nickname is Raising Cane. And apparently Donald Trump thought that made him sound badass. So it doesn't matter that he doesn't have the qualifications of CQ Brown. Let's just put him in there anyway, because he's got a name made for television, and this is all just one big game show to the man who's in charge of the country right now. He replaced Carla Hayden, who was the first woman and black person to lead the Library of Congress. Why would you do that? Why would it be necessary to replace Carla Hayden? Well, according to Caroline Levitt, she's the press secretary for the president, the one who always wears the Jesus cross even as she lies to the American people every single day. She's got the cross around her neck, but she can't tell the truth, which last time I checked is one of the commandments she's supposed to follow. She stands up in front of the American people and she says the reason that Carla Hayden had to be replaced was because as a librarian, she was allowing children to check out inappropriate materials about sexuality. Y'all ever been to the Library of Congress? Do you know anything about the Library of Congress? You don't check shit out at the Library of Congress. Children don't walk up in the Library of Congress looking for books on sexuality, right? But you don't have to know that if you're Caroline Levitt or Donald Trump or anyone in that circle, so you replace her because why? She's a black woman and you assume she's not qualified for the position. He got rid of Gwen Wilcox, who was the first black woman to serve on the National Labor Relations Board. Why? No reason in particular, but again, it seems to be of a pattern. And now he is looking to fire Lisa Cook, the first black woman to serve on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Says that she's apparently committed loan fraud, which is something the president knows a little something about, and has decided that she too should be removed. None of this is legal, by the way. None of this is constitutional, but folks are rolling over for this assault on DEIA, both at a systemic and a personal level. This is all based on the assumption that virtually no person of color in authority, especially, God forbid, a black woman, could possibly be qualified for the position they have. And you may think that I'm exaggerating, that that's what this is really about, but it's not. We know that this administration believes that only white men are competent to exercise power. We know that because people who serve in this administration say it. Right? We have a guy right now named Darren Beatty, who is the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, and he's also the head of something just appointed to the U.S. Institute of Peace. Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Darren Beatty. And back in October of last year, before the election even happened, Darren Beatty goes on Twitter and vomits up the following. He says, "Only if you have competent white men in charge will things work well." And he's also on the record and has said this on social media, that we ought to sterilize, quote unquote, low IQ trash. And if you're at all confused about who he's thinking of when he says that, make no mistake, he's clarified that. He has said, for instance, that we have to deal with feral populations, like black folks in Atlanta, whom he says we should offer free Air Jordans to so that they will voluntarily sterilize themselves. That man serves under this administration with your tax dollars paying for his salary, because that kind of open exhortation of white supremacy is now normative. It is now considered regular and acceptable. This administration has rolled back consent decrees with half a dozen police departments around the country that had agreed to those consent decrees. And when you agree to a consent decree as a police department, what you're saying is you know you've done wrong. right? It's like saying, okay, you got us, we were being unconstitutional, we were being brutal, we were treating certain people badly on the basis of color, on the basis of class, on the basis of whatever, and so you got us, and so we're going to enter into this consent decree to fix our stuff. And the administration has said, no, screw that. We don't have to worry about that. Let cops, quote unquote, be cops and do what cops do, which of course, in the mind of Donald Trump, is just break heads, hurt people, throw them in cars, and throw them in jail. He's banning research into racial inequality in health, rolling back NIH grants that look into issues of disparities in things like maternal mortality, where black women have an extremely disproportionate rate of maternal mortality, death, and maternal morbidity relative to white women, even when they have the same socioeconomic status. So it's not a class thing or economic thing. It's because of the cumulative effects of racial discrimination on the black body. But we don't want to research that because according to the administration, that's woke science. It's DEI research. So the fact that black women are disproportionately dying, that apparently isn't a problem. But the fact that we might try to study why that is and fix it, that's apparently the problem. They've rolled back and are literally shuttering the CDC's office that looks at the section of the CDC that looks at sickle cell anemia. Because since that disproportionately affects African Americans, that too apparently is woke science to care about that. DEI science, DEI medicine. And therefore unacceptable. And of course, they're banning books from K-12 schools, attacking history not only in the classroom, but in our museums, right? Trying to get rid of any displays in the Smithsonian that tell the truth about the history of enslavement, Jim Crow segregation, lynching, the theft of indigenous land, right? Trying to get rid of any display that casts a negative light on the glorious history of the United States, because we're not supposed to talk about those things, right? Clay Travis, the former sports commentator who decided he was also competent to talk about like important issues, said the other day on his show that we really ought not talk about slavery so much, because it's like, you know, he took his kid, he said, to the Air and Space Museum, which is also part of the Smithsonian, right? Said he took his kid to the Air and Space Museum, and it was great, learned all about the air and space history of the United States, and they didn't have any displays about the planes that crashed. So why should we talk about the, you know, the accidents of history like slavery? Why should we? That's sort of like a plane crash, right? Like, that's not really the story. That's just some stuff that happened. We don't need to talk about that. Let's talk about all the glories and not the negatives, as if somehow the history of enslavement was just some accident, like a plane going down, as opposed to a deliberate policy practice for a couple of 100 years, followed by another 100 years of segregation and other forms of white supremacy. See, that's the kind of thinking that we're dealing with. Trying to make it impossible for us to even understand where we came from. And the great irony of this is if you say to the American people, we need to focus on the positive and how much progress we've made, how can you appreciate the progress if you don't know where you came from? How do you appreciate the progress, which is real, but how do you appreciate that if you don't know the thing from which you were progressing? See, it doesn't even make sense on its own terms, but here we are. And of course, they're threatening colleges with their budgets if those schools do anything even remotely connected to racial inclusion and equity. And all of that begs the question, why? Why is this happening? Especially, why is it happening now? Right? Now, one perhaps cynical but possible answer is that for some of these folks, they have been itching for this fight since the end of the Civil War. They never really stopped fighting it. And as a Southerner, I can tell you that that is true. There are plenty of people, and not just in the South, right, who never, ever accepted the defeat of the Confederacy and the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. And they've been fighting this ever since. They overthrew Reconstruction beginning in 1877, and they are now seeking to overthrow the second Reconstruction emanating from the Civil Rights Movement. But putting that answer aside, I think we have a more immediate answer. The reason that this attack is happening now, the reason that the assault on racial equity or even discussions of racial equity is happening now is because in 2020, just 5 short years ago, we had the largest racial justice uprising in the history of the United States after the murder of George Floyd. We had 20 to 23 million people in the streets, and it wasn't just black and brown folk. Right? When black and brown folk protest stuff, I think we're sort of like, you know, The powers that be are sort of used to that. They know how to manage that. They know how to address that. But they're not used to seeing millions of white people in the streets too, especially young white folks, their white children, their white grandchildren. That scared the piss out of some folks. Right? So suddenly it became, oh my God, we can't have all these young folks learning about systemic racism, let alone challenging it. So the best thing we can do is take it out of the school so they won't learn about it anymore. Because if we can make it, see no evil, hear no evil, then they're not going to try to fix any evil. So we'll just try to take away their entire analytical framework by which they might understand what's going on in the world. If I make it impossible for you to know your history, then you don't understand how we got here from there. Right? If you don't understand the past, then you can't problematize the present. You can't analyze why we're in the state that we're in. Carol Anderson, brilliant scholar at Emory University in Atlanta, explains all of this in her book, White Rage. She points out that historically, every single step forward, particularly for black folks, but I would say this is true for people of color more broadly, every step forward for racial justice more broadly has been met historically with white backlash and white rage. It happened after the end of enslavement, with the overthrow of Reconstruction. It happened when black folks moved north during the Great Migration and were met with violence, pogroms of racial violence and riots against black folks moving into those spaces, and not in the South, in the Midwest, out West, in the Northeast, in the Northwest. It happened after the fall of segregation. It happened after the creation of affirmative action. It happened after the election of Barack Obama, and that didn't even really move the needle on racial injustice. That didn't even change the material reality of black and brown people, but symbolically that was a step forward in the eyes of a lot of people toward racial justice, and thus it was unacceptable. They are afraid, apparently, and this is why they backlash now. They are afraid of the reality that America is changing. It is changing culturally. It is changing demographically, and they cannot abide it. It is changing culturally to such an extent, and we all know this, right? Like, what we now have as a national culture is thoroughly multicultural. There's no undoing that. You can't even find, what is the unique white thread of existing American culture that hasn't been touched by other folks' stuff, right? I mean, good luck, look, I guess what is white culture? What is that? What is it, I guess it's Cracker Barrel, I guess is what it is. I guess it's that old white dude near the barrel, which, by the way, you do understand, they've been mocking white folks the whole time, that's the cracker, and that's the barrel, you understand, right? Apparently that's it. The white culture is about cholesterol and that damn peg game that they put at every table if you've ever been in one, right? Is that I'm being sarcastic, but the point is our culture is so interwoven, right? That the idea that we can say, well, we have to defend our culture, our heritage. Whose culture? Whose heritage? That's the point. It's all linked now. And I understand for some folks it's hard to deal with cultural change. I understand. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. When I grew up in the 1970s and early 1980s in Nashville, the grocery store, the ethnic food aisle in the grocery was like a pasta aisle, y'all, for real. And it wasn't good pasta. It wasn't that fresh shit that you can get. It was really dry spaghetti and some Chef Boyardee in a can. That was it, but that was the ethnic food. So I understand for folks that grew up like that, right? They're probably oh my God, things are changing so quickly. We got all these different religious groups. We got all these different cultural groups, all these different ethnic groups, right? I understand. But we have to understand that change is inevitable, is irreversible, just like the demographic change. I understand some white folks are freaked out, right? Because in about 10 years, white folks will no longer be the majority of the American population. Right now, those people called non-Hispanic whites by the census are about 56% of the population. So really barely a majority even now, and not even that out here, obviously, right? And within about 10 years, that number is going to be about 48%. So white folks will still be a plurality, but not the majority. And if you grew up thinking that this was a white country, which James Baldwin reminded us a long time ago it never was, but if you had the luxury of believing this was just some outpost of Europe, right? Then the idea that you got to share space with people that look a lot different, pray a lot different, have different cultural traditions, I get it, it can shake you up, right? But the reality is that demographic change is inevitable. And I'll have more to say about that in a second, but just make no mistake, that's why folks are freaking out. That's why they get upset when Little Mermaid has a black actress play the Little Mermaid in a live action version of the Little Mermaid. They freaked out about that. My God, you can't make the Little Mermaid black. Everybody knows that mermaids have red hair. Right? Everyone understands the mermaids are Irish, right? The women with the tails and the fins, they all got red hair and freckles or whatever the hell, right? They can't be black. It's a fictional character, but you can't make her black. Snow White, you can't make Snow White Latina. What? You can't do that. Everybody knows Snow White is, well, shit, she's white. Like, that's the thing, right? So they freak out over the littlest things. Bud Light having a trans influencer. Oh my God. Can't have that. You take away our Bud Light and we'll just send Kid Rock out to shoot the shit in a field somewhere with a semi-automatic weapon. What kind of adults? I mean, I'm making fun of it, but it's deadly serious. The Cracker Barrel thing. Now they've caved in, they put the old white dude back. So congratulations, MAGA, I guess. The Uncle Herschel old white dude with the barrels, the only working class white person Donald Trump gives a shit about, but apparently he's got his job back. That's good to know. Right? But for the rest of working class white folks, there's nothing being done for y'all, nothing being done for any working class white person that you know. Right? Except for Uncle Herschel, who's going to get to sit on the barrel or next to the barrel at the Cracker Barrel. So everybody can come in and get their biscuits and gravy or whatever they eat there. Right? They are afraid of change because they assume change means a lowering of quality in our schools and our workplace. And they assume that because, frankly, that's what we've been taught. That's the dirty little secret. It's not just them, it's even in us to a large degree. Because every last one of us was raised to believe one thing in common in this country. I know this is true. Regardless of your politics, regardless of your racial identity or your ethnicity or cultural background, the one thing that I know we were all taught is that wherever you end up in America is all about your effort, right? The notion of meritocracy, rugged individualism. So if you work hard, you can make it. If you didn't make it, it's your own damn fault. You should have worked harder. That is like the American cornerstone ideology, right? Like if America was a Bible, that would be Genesis 1:1, right? This notion of meritocracy and rugged individualism. The problem is if you're taught that, and then you look around and you see profound inequality, right? You see inequality between people, and you notice that that inequality is not just between individuals, but like it has a color coordination to it, so that white folks are disproportionately, not exclusively, but disproportionately on the top of the hierarchy, and black and brown folk are disproportionately lower than that on the hierarchy, then it starts to almost make sense to you, doesn't it? To think that, man, I guess those white people are just superior, and I guess those folks of color somehow they don't work as hard, they don't have the right values, their cultures are broken, flawed, maybe their biology is even faulty in some way, right? It almost starts to make a sick kind of sense, because if you believe where you end up is all about your own effort, and certain folks disproportionately end up at the bottom, then it makes some sense to conclude there must be something wrong with them. Same thing is true with sexism, right? Misogyny and sexism all start to make sense if you see a hierarchy with men disproportionately at the top, women disproportionately below. You start thinking, well, I guess those women just don't want it as badly. They don't work as hard. They don't have the same determination or drive. They're inferior in some way. The class system starts to make sense to you, because you see rich folks at the top and you see poor and working class folks at the bottom, and if you were told wherever you end up is all about your effort, and once again, every last damn one of us was told that, whether you were born and raised here or you just came here last week, you've been told it, right? Then the class system starts to make sense. You start to think to yourself, I guess working class, even working class white folks, I guess they're inferior too, right? I guess those white folks in Appalachia, I guess white folks living in trailers, they must be inferior too. Right? Because if they weren't, they'd have made something of themselves. And we start to think that the rich are naturally superior. Elon Musk just must be that smart, because he's got all that damn money. Elon Musk, that smart, even though his self-driving cars don't self-drive and they keep running into shit. Even though his rockets keep blowing up as soon as they take off. And every time it happens, it's another successful launch. No, honey, that's not a successful launch. That's a failure. Not a black engineer in the bunch. Very few, I would say, that are brown, but nonetheless, he would tell us that white people apparently are the ones we need more of in those positions. I do want to at least congratulate Elon Musk on one thing, though, and I do want to give him his props where they are deserved. Elon Musk has demonstrated for all of us that, in fact, it is possible to identify an unqualified African American, because that would be him. I'm going to let that joke roll over you for a second. Some of you don't get it because you don't know where Elon's from, but if you know where he's from, you understand he is African American, albeit white, and he has proven by his own incompetence at virtually everything that he has touched, irrespective of the money that he has made touching them, that in fact there are unqualified African Americans. They just don't happen to be black. All of this starts to make sense, this racism, this sexism, this classism, based on the underlying teaching that we all imbibe, that we live in this meritocracy. But what is the reality? What is the truth? The truth is, of course, that we don't. Black folks with a college degree are about 70% more likely, 1.7 times as likely, to be unemployed as white folks with a degree, even when they majored in the same thing. Latinx folks with a degree, approximately 1.5 times more likely to be unemployed than comparable whites, even when they majored in the same thing. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, about 1.2 times, that is to say 20% more likely than comparable whites to be out of work, even when they both have college degrees in similar disciplines. So it's not a meritocracy. Even when folks of color are just as qualified, they struggle in the labor market. We know that right now in certain areas of employment, even when you have a good job, the pay scales are not the same. You look at something like electrical engineering, which is the highest paying, one of, if not the highest paying profession in the country, and yet when black folks work as electrical engineers, and Latino folks work as electrical engineers, you got to go through the same training, got the same degree, right? So you think they would earn pretty close to one another, but in fact, black folks working as electrical engineers make 71 cents on the dollar of what white engineers make, and Latino engineers 73 cents on the dollar. And so the opportunities are simply not equal, irrespective of the mythology of meritocracy. White households headed by high school dropouts have 25% greater net worth on average than black households headed by college grads. Let me say that again. Households that are white, headed by people that didn't even finish high school, are better off than black households headed by college graduates. If this were a meritocracy, that would not obviously be true, and yet it is. So in light of all that, that's why it's so important that we stand up and defend the two things that I came here to defend, because I didn't just come to critique, I came to defend something. DEIA efforts, first and foremost, and critical race theory, which is the way in which we can understand all of this stuff that's going on. Both of those are under attack, but both of those require a full-throated defense and an end to the defensiveness that some people have around defending them. So let's start with DEIA. Why do we need DEIA efforts? Well, it'd be obvious based on the data that I shared with you, but if that's not enough, let's just think about it logically. You cannot solve for identity-based exclusion with identity-blind measures. What do I mean by that? If you have a history in which people were excluded based on their identity, be that racial, ethnic, cultural, sex or gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, whatever the identity might be, if you have a history in which people have been marginalized on the basis of X, Y, or Z thing, you cannot solve for the marginalization without basing your solution on the X, Y, or Z thing that caused the injury in the first place, right? If you deny opportunity to people based on their identity, you have to target opportunity to them because they're the ones that were excluded. This ought to be obvious. There should be nothing controversial about me saying that, and yet it appears to be quite controversial to say it in this country. The idea that we can just solve everybody's needs and meet their needs with some type of universal colorblind openness is just not true. To treat everybody the same ignores the inertia and the residue of that past marginalization. And it ignores ongoing marginalization. Right? It ignores ongoing racism, ongoing sexism, ongoing ableism, ongoing transphobia, ongoing all of those things. Right? But certainly it ignores the residue and the history of it. And we have to understand that history has inertia, right? We learned about inertia probably in like middle school or grade school or something, right? That's Newton's first law of motion, that an object in motion tends to remain in motion, unless it's met by some force of equal or greater power that arrests its forward trajectory. So we understand if I roll a ball down the hill, it's going to keep rolling until one of maybe three things happens. Either it bumps into something and that stops it, or maybe somebody picks the ball up, or if not those two, the third thing, the friction between the ball and the ground eventually slows it down and it comes to a stop. We understand that. But inertia isn't just a property of the physical universe, right? It's a property of the historical universe, the socioeconomic universe. The things that happen in one generation affect the next, and the next, and the next, until a force of equal or greater power intervenes to arrest that forward trajectory. And so if you have a history of systemic discrimination against people on the basis of their identity, and no serious scholar or anyone who has a Google machine, for God's sake, should be able to deny that. If you have that history, then by definition it is going to have inertia into the present, which is why DEIA efforts are so important, because they attempt to arrest the forward trajectory of that historical residue. Right? We need to have universalism, sure, in the sense that we want to meet everyone's needs, including people who are members of quote-unquote dominant groups. But in order to do a universalism that works for everyone, it has to be targeted, meaning that if we're trying to serve everyone, we have to know the particular blockages that keep us from doing that, right? So if we're wanting to serve the needs of white folks just like we are people of color, then sure. And we need to make sure that whatever barriers might be blocking access for certain subgroups of white people are cleared away. If that's socioeconomic status, we need to address that. If that's disability, we need to address that. If that's heterosexism or transphobia, we need to address that. If that's misogyny and sexism, we need to address that. It's not to say that we don't care about what happens to white folks in classes and schools and companies and in society. It just means we have to look at the things that are holding them back, and it's not their race. Right? It's clearly not their race, given that data that I shared with you a second ago, which demonstrates the ongoing systemic advantages to being white. Now, that doesn't mean that white folks won't suffer under the class system. Millions will. There are millions of white folks suffering, unable to pay for health care, unable to afford higher education, unable to pay their rent. No kidding, but that's not because they're white. It is in spite of the fact that they are white, right? So we need to address the particular obstacles that people face. Not just the racial ones, but all of the other ones. That's a form of universalism, but you see it's targeted. And the only way you get targeted universalism is when we have something like a DEIA effort. Without those deliberate efforts, the marginalized are not going to trust that people will accept them in those institutional spaces. The reason we need DEIA in colleges and universities and in corporations, right, is because if we don't make a specific effort to outreach and recruit and then mentor people who otherwise would be overlooked, guess what? They'll still be overlooked. Or they might walk through the door, but they're not going to have a sense that they belong. They might not know anyone in their family or in their neighborhood or their community who's worked for that institution or gone to that institution or spent a lot of time around that institution. So they don't have the confidence that they can just waltz into any space and be accepted. The only people that can do that are dominant majority groups, right? Women can't just assume they can go anywhere they please, the way that men can. Poor folks of all colors don't just assume they can go wherever they please, the way that affluent and wealthy folks can. LGBTQ plus folks don't think they can just waltz up into any space that straight and cisgendered folks can, right? Black and brown folks don't just assume they can walk into any space the way white folks can. When you are a member of a marginalized group historically and contemporaneously, you're thinking about some stuff that other folks aren't thinking about. And those of us who are members of the dominant groups in those different categories that I mentioned have the luxury, or we might say the privilege, of being oblivious to other people's reality, right? So when you're white, you have the privilege of being oblivious to the racism and the race-based discrimination that folks of color face. When you're a man, you can be oblivious to what misogyny and sexism and rape culture are for women. When you're straight or cisgender, you can be oblivious to heterosexism and transphobia. And it's not because you're a bad person, by the way. It just is because you had never had to think about it. Right? And when you haven't had to think about something, you probably aren't going to know much about it. No crime in that. The problem is when you don't acknowledge it and try to do better. Right? It's fine to be oblivious about, I'm oblivious about a lot. I'm oblivious about calculus, y'all. You know why? Because I didn't take that shit in school. And the reason I didn't take it is because the Metro Nashville public school system did not require me to take calculus. And my thing was, if you're not going to make me take it, I'm definitely not signing up for the abuse. That was my thought. Right? So if I were to stand up here right now and try to do calculus on y'all, and any of you had ever taken it, you would instantly know that I did not know what in the hell I was talking about. Right? You would know it immediately, which is probably why I wouldn't try to do it. But you see, we got a lot of folks in this country that are members of dominant groups who have the luxury of being ignorant to other people's reality, trying to talk about those other people's reality. Got a lot of white folks think we know when racism is happening better than the folks of color who live it. Got a lot of men think that we know when rape culture or misogyny are existing better than the women who experience it. We have a lot of straight and cisgendered folk who think that we're qualified to even opine on whether trans folk are real. Right? Where does that arrogance come from? It comes from obliviousness and the luxury of not having to know better. And again, there's no shame in not knowing better. When you haven't been taught things, of course you don't know them. The problem is, once you're taught them, you do have an obligation to try a little harder. Right? And that's what DEIA tries to get us to do, to put us in situations where we have to learn, and where we have to stretch, and where we might have to struggle a little bit with however we were raised, or whatever our parents taught us, or whatever we learned or picked up from the media, or whatever we picked up from the ethos of America more broadly. I know it's tough, it can be difficult, but that's what growth is about. That's certainly what education is about. Without those deliberate efforts, a lot of the success that we see coming from DEIA programs wouldn't happen. Those programs are helpful. They are successful. They allow people to have opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have, access they wouldn't otherwise have, that benefits themselves, their families, their communities, and the whole country benefits from that. You take away those efforts, those deliberate efforts, and you just say to everybody, well, good luck and God bless, and we'll have the same folks that fell through the cracks always continuing to fall through those cracks. And none of DEIA, by the way, is prefaced or predicated, I should say, on this idea that white people are bad. That's what folks say. You're trying to make white people feel guilty over something. DEIA didn't do any of that. DEIA isn't premised on that. DEIA is not about white people as people. It's not about men as men. It's not about straight and cisgender people as straight and cisgender people. It's about systems, right? It's not about you as an individual. Nobody's calling anybody a name when they talk about white supremacy unless you're a white supremacist. In which case, yeah, we're talking about you. Yes. At that point, yes. Right? But unless you are on board with that system, if you really are against it like everybody says they are, because every white person tells you that, every white person old enough will tell you they marched with Dr. King. Oh, I marched with Dr. King. If all the white people said they marched with Dr. King and actually marched with Dr. King, I wouldn't have to be here today. We wouldn't have to do this work. Right? But folks will tell you how down they are, and yet, at the end of the day, they don't understand that this is a systemic critique. They think they're being attacked. No one is talking about individuals. The same is true with critical race theory. That was the first thing on the agenda for Donald Trump back near the end of his first term. Right? He decided to attack critical race theory, issued an executive order banning any trainings rooted in critical race theory, something he couldn't define if his life depended on it. Something that most people couldn't. That's not just a Donald Trump problem. It's an American problem. Most people can't define it. If I were to take those who criticize CRT, hold them by their ankles over a bridge and threaten to drop them, unless they could tell me in 30 seconds what critical race theory is with a reasonably accurate definition, I promise you, everybody's getting dropped. And I'm not a violent person at all, but I'd be dropping some people because nobody could answer the question, right? They attack something that they don't understand. They make it a boogeyman on purpose and refuse to discuss what it really is. But what is critical race theory? And Let's start actually with how it was created and why. Because if you understand how and why it was created, it becomes very easy to understand why it's so helpful and why it's so important. And when you understand why it's helpful and what it's helpful for, then you'll understand why it's under attack. So let's start at the beginning. Where does critical race theory come from? It emerges in the 1980s, principally in legal scholarship in law schools. And as it was being crafted by legal scholars, the reason they did this and created this school of thought was because as legal scholars, they were looking around and they were noticing that in spite of 20 to 30 years of civil rights progress, despite 20 to 30 years of civil rights laws being on the books or desegregation going back to the Brown v. Board decision in 1954, after 20 or 30 years of the civil rights revolution, the profound inequalities between white folks and folks of color really hadn't budged very much, right? There had been some improvements in certain areas, but for the most part, the systemic inequalities were still there, the obstacles were still there, the outcomes were still wildly disparate between white folks and people of color, and they wanted to know why. And when you want to understand why something's happened, what do? You devise a theory. That's what theories are. Every theory is just an attempt to understand shit that you're looking at. Like, how is that happening? Why is that happening? What is that? And so they wanted to understand, because as legal scholars, they had been trained and taught to believe that when the law changes, everything changes, right? So you pass all these great laws and it's going to make things better. And it's going to change the underlying social reality. So once you get the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and it didn't really change things to any substantial systemic degree, or at least not as much as had been expected, then you can understand they were like, damn, why didn't it work? Right? Why do we still have all this inequality? And what's interesting about them asking that question, first amongst themselves and then bringing the analysis that they came up with to a broader audience, is that everybody was asking the same question, y'all, regardless of their politics. Right? Conservatives were asking the same question. Mainstream liberals were asking the same question. Why do we still have all of this inequality if we've got all this legal change? The conservatives were looking at it and their answer was, well, the reason it didn't really change things is that black folks are broken. That was basically their explanation, right? Black folks, their cultures are defective. They don't make good choices. They don't take personal responsibility for their lives, blah, 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 right? So it's them. They're the problem. That was their answer to the very same question that the critical race theorists were asking. Mainstream liberals asked the same question. Their answer was a little different. They said, well, you know, it's just we've been working at it hard. We've gone about 90% of the way. We just got to keep pushing. It was that very sort of optimistic attitude that Barack Obama had. He actually made that 90% argument himself at a campaign rally. We're 90% of the way. A lot of black folks heard that and they were like, maybe not 90. Right? Maybe not 90. But, you know, the idea behind the liberal optimism was, well, we just got to get a little more money for this program, a little more training for this thing, right? We can fix it with public policy, a little bit of tinkering around the edges, reform this, reform that, and it'll get us where we need to go. So it's a very optimistic explanation. It's like, yeah, we're not quite there, but we'll get there. And the critical theorists looked at it and went, I don't think either one of those are right. They looked at the conservative answer and they certainly rejected that one. They weren't going to victim blame, right? But they also looked at the liberal answer and that wasn't satisfying to them either. It's like, something else is going on. Their analysis, their conclusion was that the reason the inequality persisted in spite of the legal changes is because the system was more ingrained than we had been led to believe. And that it was so deeply ingrained in the American psyche and law and custom that it would shape-shift like a transformer and just keep moving on down the road, right? So it's like whack-a-mole, right? At the carnival, you hit the mole, damn thing pops up over here, you hit it there, it pops up over there. That was basically their argument, was this thing will just keep moving around. It's not going to go away. These people don't lose well that run this system. They're not just going to give up, right? You can't just defeat white supremacy once and the white supremacists and the people that benefited from that system look up and go, oh, well, we gave it our best shot. I guess we'll just accept losing. Like, that's not who these people are. It's not who they ever were, right? And so they said the system is deeply ingrained, and so when you shut it down in one way, they'll figure out another way to recreate it. There's plenty of historical examples of this. I'll give you a few of them. Number one, think about it. During the period of enslavement, when white supremacy was being operated at this really maximum level, what did they do to maintain white supremacy? They forcibly bred black people, right? They forcibly bred black folks so that more babies would be born. Why? Because then those babies would become property and that would increase their wealth and that would sustain white supremacy. But as soon as enslavement was over, they moved the goalpost and they switched up the game, and now they moved toward doing what? Sterilizing black women to keep them from having children. And indigenous women, by the way, and Latinas, but especially black women early on, right? The idea was we have to restrict reproduction. Literally the year before, they're doing it on purpose, trying to encourage it. But then when enslavement is no longer allowed, white supremacy requires not more black people, it requires fewer black people, right? So that's an example of shape-shifting. You can move into the more current era. The Brown v. Board decision comes down in 1954. And what does it say? It says you can't have segregated schools anymore. But of course, the people who loved the segregation system weren't going to just accept that and go, oh, well, you got us. You know, what are we going to do? It was a nice thing while it lasted, right? No, immediately they went about trying to figure out how else can we sustain white supremacy, even though the law says we can't do it this way anymore. So they established segregation academies, private schools, right, that could deny admission to black folks and run themselves as segregated institutions. And they started clamoring for something you've heard a lot about nowadays, vouchers and school choice. Literally, the year after Brown v. Board of Education was decided was the first time that that concept was ever talked about in print. Milton Friedman, a noted economist at the time, writes a piece in 1955 where he talks about the importance of school choice. We need to let parents choose where to send their children and give them vouchers so their tax money can follow them to whatever school they want to go to, whether it's public or one of those private segregation academies. Now, is it a coincidence that vouchers and school choice only became a thing in the wake of Brown v. Board? Like, Milton Friedman had been an economist for a minute. He didn't apparently think this was so important in 1953 or 1951 or 1948, but by 1955 it's like, holy hell, we really need vouchers. The only difference was that the system had now said you can't segregate anymore. So vouchers and school choice were born out of a desire to maintain white supremacy. The Civil Rights Act gets passed in 1964, and what happens immediately? Employers begin changing the requirements to get jobs. You might wonder what I'm talking about. I'll give you one example. It was not the only one. A company called the Duke Power Company over in North Carolina. The day that the Civil Rights Act actually went into effect, it was passed in 64, it became law in early 1965, is when it actually becomes law and starts to have effect. And the day that the law goes into effect, the Duke Power Company decided that in order to get an entry-level job, not a high job, not a management job, not an executive job, just an entry-level job, suddenly it was necessary to get a high school diploma and to also have a certain score on the Wonderlic Industrial Aptitude Test. Right? They never needed the Wonderlic Industrial Aptitude Test before, and you didn't even need a high school diploma before, because you could just do what? Discriminate against black people openly. But now that you can't do that, now it's like, oh my God, can you believe we've been running this power company without the benefit of the Wonderlic Industrial Aptitude Test? How the hell did we do that? How did we keep the power on without employees selected by virtue of their score on the Wonderlic Industrial Aptitude Test? We should impose that. They did that because they knew that black folks would do worse on the test, because the education system in North Carolina had deliberately underfunded black schools. In some communities all throughout the South, they just shut down black schools after like 8th grade, right? So they knew that if you need a high school diploma, guess who's not going to have that? Disproportionately. And if you need a score on this standardized test, guess who's not going to get that score, right? So it was an example of white supremacy, once again, shape-shifting to maintain itself even when the law changes. So you understand, critical race theory actually helps us make sense of why we're still talking about this Hundreds of years after the system is put in place, you would think that with as many good people and smart people and really caring and compassionate people that we have, that we could have tackled it by now. But critical race theory says not so fast. What y'all don't understand is this system is doing exactly what it was intended to do, sustaining itself at all costs, shifting shape and morphing into whatever it needs to in order to maintain itself. Again, this is about systems, not individuals. Good people get caught up in bad systems. And if you're a good person and you get caught up in a bad system, you're going to have a hell of a time changing that system. That system is just as likely to change you because it has more power than the individual, right? It has that collective logic. And education is a perfect example of this. It's very important for y'all to realize that the education system that was set up in this country was never intended to serve the people that go to this institution disproportionately. I'm not just talking about folks of color. I mean working class and lower middle class folks. The educational system was set up for elites. White male elites. The whole idea of a community college would have been entirely foreign to the founders of this country. Because talking about empowering the community, education for all, are you kidding? Right? So when they attack DEIA, they might as well just announce war on the very concept of community colleges. Because the whole concept of a community college is to serve the community and meet the needs of all the different folks in that community. Not just the folks who've always been going to college, but the folks who haven't been. Community college is a DEIA program. Right? But that's what these folks never wanted. We know they never wanted it because the people that set up the system told us they didn't. Let's take it back to Thomas Jefferson. He was considered during his day a very forward-thinking educational philosopher. And in Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson articulated the vision for the new nation that was going to be, that was coming into being at that time, a vision for the educational system. What did he say? He said, what we need is about 6 years of mandatory schooling. Now, he didn't mean that for everybody. He wasn't talking about black folks. He wasn't talking about indigenous people. He wasn't even talking about girls and women, right? He was just talking about white men like himself. But what he said was 6 years of compulsory schooling, and his reason for it was very revealing. What did he say the reason was? Why we should make sure all the, at least white guys, get 6 years? Because that way we can, these are his words, not mine, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. I want you to think about that. Rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Remember, he's not talking about black folks as rubbish. He's not talking about, we know what he thought about them. It's probably worse than that. He's just talking about other white men. He's basically calling most white men trash too. He's looking at white guys saying, most of y'all are garbage, but if we give you 6 years of schooling, we'll figure out which among you are smart enough to run this place and which the rest of y'all are going to work for us. So his whole concept was that the purpose of school was inequality, not equality. You've heard people say education is the great equalizer. Jefferson was like, what the hell are you smoking? It is not the great equalizer. It is the unequalizer on purpose. Fast forward to the early 1900s, Woodrow Wilson, before he becomes president of the United States, he's president of Princeton University. What does Wilson say? He was also considered at that time a very forward-thinking educational theorist. And what did Wilson say? He said something very similar to Jefferson. He said, well, what we need is we need one group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. That was the term they used to use for college. It doesn't mean liberal like ideologically, right? So basically saying one group should prepare themselves for college. And then he went on to say another group, much larger by necessity in this and every other society, should forego the privilege of a liberal/college education and instead should prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. Think about that. It's the same thing Jefferson said, a little bit flowery, more flowery, but basically saying the same thing. Some of y'all are going to, and he's not talking about everybody. Again, Woodrow Wilson was a vicious racist vis-a-vis black folks. So he wasn't even thinking about black folks. He's not thinking about any group of color. He's not talking about Asian immigrants. He's not talking about most women. He's talking about other white people. He's saying, white folks, most of y'all are not fit to lead. Most of our own group is not fit. Y'all working class and poor folks, lower income folks, you just need to sweat and do the difficult work that me and my boys are too precious to do because we are the elite. That's what he's saying. He is saying the same thing as Jefferson. The purpose of school is inequality by design. And although you might think to yourself, well, that was a long time. Woodrow Wilson, man, he's been dead a long time. He was president like well over 100 years ago, president of Princeton well over 100 years ago, so maybe things have changed, but see, it hasn't, because now you can fast forward all the way to 2001. And George W. Bush is president, and they passed the No Child Left Behind education reform bill, and shortly after that law became law, they had William Bennett, who used to be the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan when he was president. They had Bill Bennett on one of the Sunday talk shows. I should point out as a side note, there was a time when Bill Bennett was the worst education secretary that we had ever had, but I mean, records are meant to be broken, so, you know, now we have the wrestling lady, just so we're clear. Prior to her, we had, in the first Trump administration, the Amway lady. Now we have the wrestling lady whose only claim to fame is that she smacked the shit out of her own daughter at WWE Raw. And she's now running the school system in this country, so nice job. Anyway, so Bill Bennett is on one of the Sunday talk shows, and they're asking him about the new law, right? What does he think about it? And they asked this question. It was amazing. They said, well, Secretary Bennett, because apparently you get to still get called secretary even when you hadn't been in the gig for like 20 years or whatever. They asked him, Secretary Bennett, what do you think the biggest problem facing American education is today? And that's a big question, right? You can imagine a lot of good answers. Your answer to that, if I asked you, you might say, well, college is unaffordable. Okay, that's an acceptable answer. Or we don't adequately fund K-12. Okay, that's an adequate answer. You could make that argument, or you could say, man, it's crazy that we use standardized tests to determine where people are going to go to school in many cases, even though they didn't receive standardized educations with standardized resources and standardized curricula. You could make that argument. Any of those arguments would be good arguments. You could make a great argument for any of them. Bill Bennett didn't say any of that. Bill Bennett looks into the eye of the questioner and he says, in response to the question, that the biggest problem facing American education is that too many people are going to college. Now ask yourself, who do you think he's talking about? Because see, the interviewer didn't follow up and ask him. That's what I would have asked. Who's going that shouldn't be going? Who are we talking about? Because you've got to know the answer, right? Like, let's just start with the obvious. We know who he's not talking about. He's not talking about the rich and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents who are working on 5 generations of rich mediocrity, especially the white ones. I've known a lot of white, rich, mediocre people. My guess is you have met a few yourself, right? Who, despite their mediocrity, no one ever tells them not to go to college, right? You go to any of those prep schools on the East Coast, any private academy that you want to find, correct me if I'm wrong, there's always somebody graduated last in the class, am I right? They can't just all be valedictorians. You got the valedictorian and whoever the hell graduated dead last, the opposite of the valedictorian, but nobody ever goes into those places and finds the least competent white person in the bunch and says, I'm so sorry, but I don't think you really are meant to be a doctor or a lawyer or run your daddy's business. I think you should work in a warehouse. Nobody ever does that. So we know that he's not talking about rich and white and mediocre people. When he says too many people are going to college, by definition, he means the people who weren't going previously. And who were they? Working class people of all colors, not just folks of color, and people of color specifically. It's sort of the mentality of the enslaver, right? Why, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton? Right? That was one of the incentives to not let enslaved people learn to read, because then they would think they were too good to pick it. So today the version would be, well, if they all go to college, even a community college, right? Not Yale or Harvard or Princeton, even a community college. If they all go to college, who's going to change the bedpans at the hospital, and who's going to change the sheets at the hotel, and who's going to pick the strawberries in the field? Who's going to do the difficult labor that we, again, are too precious and special to do, right? In other words, from Thomas Jefferson all the way to the present, the people who designed and ran our educational system have told us inequality is the point. If inequality is the point, then that means that this system that we have is not failing people. Sometimes you'll hear that. People say, our system is failing children by not properly educating. Our system is failing work. It's not failing. If a system was never set up for you, and then it proceeds not to serve you, that's not failure, that's success on the system's terms, right? That's the system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The only way that you can understand that is through the lens of critical race theory. Liberal theory can't explain it. Conservative theory certainly can't explain it. Only critical analysis can explain that, which is why it is under attack. because you have to take away the frameworks that allow you to understand the world in which you live. And if you take away that systemic framework, all you are left with is the rugged individualism myth, right? If you make it impossible for people to understand the historical and contemporary barriers to equity and fairness and justice, then all they are left with is, well, it must be their own damn fault. That is what this is about. This is an assault on our ability to understand the world, let alone our ability to change the world, which is why I'm so honored to have been asked to come here today to talk to you about these things and to see a community college system here in this community, in this city, that is working hard to defy the attack against the principles of equal education and justice and opportunity. It has been a pleasure to spend some time with you. I appreciate your time, and I'll take any questions that you have at this point. Thank you all so much for having me. Thanks, y'all. So we got about 24 minutes, I think, right? Till 3:30? Yeah.
Okay, I'm not gonna wait.
Right.
Yeah.
We can run a mic to you, but you probably don't need it. But we can.
Well, accessibility, I'll wait.
Yeah, we'll do it. Great.
So just a couple of things. First, I wanted to ask about, you were talking about how we got here, why we're here, what's going on, and the threat, the imminent threat to the population change and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Is there an innate fear that possibly some people don't recognize, but possibly some people don't want to talk about it?
Yeah.
That it's also about the fact that we've now watched for hundreds of years how non-whites are treated.
Yeah.
And if they become the minority, now it's going to be okay to treat us this way.
Of course. Yeah, that's the fear, right. I think that's an existential fear that a lot of people have, and it's always been that way in it's hilarious to me that in every oppressive society that's ever existed, ever, not just ours, that's always the fear of the people in power. I have no doubt King Louis was sitting there, you know, at Versailles like, holy shit, you know, like, holy hell. If we actually do something to improve the lives of anyone, they're going to take my shit. Look at this castle, like, they're going to come and burn this to the ground. So he just decided to hold on, and what they do, I think we know, right? So the irony is people act as if somehow changing society for a just outcome is going to lead to revenge, when the only thing that ever leads to revenge is not changing society to make it more just, right? Not changing it. Changing it is not the problem. They said this in South Africa too. Everybody in South Africa was like, oh my God, if apartheid falls, they're going to come and kill us all. Well, apartheid was inevitably going to fall. You cannot maintain, the Soviet Union couldn't maintain its system. No oppressive system has ever been able to maintain its system. And yet they all say the same thing. Folks in Israel saying the same shit right now, like somehow you can just keep killing Palestinians forever and a day, and it's never going to go sideways for you. Like, give me a break. Everybody with any sense understands that you cannot oppress forever, because when you do it over and over and over, you give people a sense that they got nothing to lose. And people that got nothing to lose are dangerous. But not because you made space for them, because you didn't make space for them. And so to the extent that fear is real, it's all the more reason to get on board the justice train right now and make sure people know where you stand. Right? But I think the thing that I forgot to point out that I want to, because I think you're right, that's part of the fear. The most important thing about the fear is that you can't let it render you inoperative and immobile, because that fear it's impossible to undo the thing that's really generating it. And here's what I mean by that. I mentioned it, I alluded to it earlier, the demographic shift, and you'll hear all these white nationalists screaming about the great replacement, and oh my God, they're trying to replace. Ain't nobody trying to replace you, precious, but here's the problem. The median age of white women in this country is 46. Now I just want you to imagine for a minute what that means for demographic change in America, right? When the median of the women in your society in a particular racial subgroup is 46, you ain't going to be having a lot of babies coming from those women. I don't know any 46-year-old or older women that are clamoring to make babies again. I don't know any 46 or older women, white or otherwise, that are like, yeah, let me just have another baby. Let me just start all that shit over again so I can have an 18-year-old when I'm 64 or 65. That sounds like a great deal. Nobody's signing up for that. So if the median age of your group's women is 46, and that's the midpoint, right? Half are older than that, then your birth rates are never going to recover. There's no way that you can actually reverse that demographic shift, especially when the black median for women is 36. It's on the upper end of the primary fertility spectrum, but it's still there. And the median age for Latinas is 30. And the median age for Asian and Pacific Islander women is about 33, right? So the future of America is brown, or there is no future for us. And I think white folks better get it through our head. We need more immigration, not less. We need more folks, because honestly, there are not going to be enough white folks to run things. There are not going to be enough white folks in the workforce to pay for old white people's Social Security. And as a 57-year-old white person who's going to be trying to get Social Security in 8 years if it's still around, if the Doge boys haven't destroyed it by leaking all of our information, right, which is now what we're finding out they did at the beginning of this administration, assuming it's still there, I'm going to need some folk to be working, because you do realize, see, I think people don't always realize, we think Social Security is something they take out of our check and put it in a safe deposit box. And then we get it back with interest. That's not how it works. Today's retirees are being paid by virtue of the withholding on today's employees. And that's how it had to be set up, right? Because in the earliest days when the Social Security Act was passed, you had people retiring who hadn't had a chance to pay in yet because the program didn't exist. The only way you could pay it was to take it out of existing employees. So who are those employees going to be? If the median age for white women is 46, they ain't going to be white children. They're not going to be white folks, right? And I'll give you a statistic that's even more alarming. I mean, not alarming to me, but it just ought to make the point that there's no point in being afraid. The future's coming whether you like it or not. So I said the median age is 46. Let me tell you another statistic. The modal age. I don't know if you remember this from your math classes, right? But the median's the midpoint. The mode refers to whichever number appears the most often in a given set. So when you have a set of people, whatever the most common number, let's say that most common age is, would be the modal age for that group. The modal age for white people, which means the age that is most common for white people in this country, is 58 years old. So I'm still a year under average. I will be decidedly average in a year, and then I will get to be above average, which will be great because I'm 5'8" and a half, and I've never been above average. But 58 years old, y'all. 58 is the modal age. The modal age for black folks is 26. That's the most common age for black folks. You know what the modal age for Latinos and Latinas is? It's 11. What is that? What does that mean, y'all? Like, just practically, what do you think that means? It means that if we don't make sure we have opportunities for that 11-year-old, who will soon be a 15-year-old, then a 25, then a 35, then a 45, then the society does not sustain itself. We do not survive. So on a basic, like putting aside all the morality and all the ethics and just doing what's right, like on a most practical level, the future of the country is either multiracial democracy or it is not a democracy at all. And we know where some folks want to carry us, right? But that's not even sustainable. Like, you literally won't have enough Nazis running around to keep the trains running on time, or whatever it is you think Nazis are good at, right? And so we might be afraid of the payback, as you're saying, but number one, the payback only becomes more likely the more that you oppress people, and number two, the changes that are coming about which you are afraid are literally irreversible unless we go full-ass Handmaid's Tale. And I know some of them want that. No doubt about it. That's why they're saying things. Why do you think yesterday when Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce announced that they were getting married, you got all these right-wing folks on Fox and Newsmax and all this stuff, and Charlie Kirk, right, that troll, is out talking about, well, that's good, they should make a bunch of babies. Charlie actually said that she should submit to her husband because she's not in charge. Okay, whatever. Pretty sure I know whose bank account's bigger, but okay, she's not in charge. But then they were talking about they need to make a lot of babies, right? And they're paranoid about the loss of white dominance, so they want all these white women to start having a bunch of babies. But like I said, you could start making babies tomorrow. You're never going to be able to replace the drop-off because every society that becomes economically advanced sees birth rates decline. It always happens, right? Because now people have more options, they have more opportunities. So a woman might say to herself, in the past, well, I got to get married as early as I can and make kids, or else I'll be considered a quote-unquote old maid, and I'll be mocked and ridiculed, and I can't have a career because it's 1920-something or 1950-something, and so I can't really have much of a career, so this is my only option. Once women have more opportunities, right, they might still want to have a kid, but they might delay childbirth until they're 30, or, and then at that point you're not going to have as many kids as you would have had at some point in the past. So you can't put the genie back in the bottle. All you can do is get on the train of justice and equity and ride with it along with the other folks, and then you don't have to worry about payback. You don't have to worry about revenge. All you got to worry about is how do we make this thing work for everybody, right? Thank you for the question.
And then just one comment that, I don't want you to answer this because I don't want anyone to know. I hope you are protecting yourself, given the world that we are in and how important you are and what you have to say. So I hope that you are finding the ways you need to protect yourself.
I mean, I have security. Not here. I probably shouldn't say that, but I'm pretty open target here. But no,
You need to worry about who's here is probably not who you need.
No, I know. But I'm sure. I do what I can. But here's the thing. There is no perfect protection, and right now there's actually a prosecution of 2 neo-Nazi white supremacist terrorist organization leaders from the Terrorgram Collective who had marked me for assassination, as well as 30 other people, including the former mayor of Chicago, 2 federal judges, a U.S. senator, and several others. Luckily, they were arrested last year. They're being prosecuted. We all had, kill cards that they had created with pictures of our houses. Our names, our phone numbers, our address, picture of the house, information on the family if they had that. And they were promising sainthood in this white supremacist cult to anyone who killed any of us. So that shit is real. And at the same time, I remember, it's scary when the FBI comes to your house twice in 15 months to tell you that somebody's trying to kill you, which is what happened to us. But you know what's a lot scarier than being marked for death by white supremacists and neo-Nazis and terrorists is riding this train to the end and not doing the work. That's scarier. Because whatever's going to happen to us as a country is going to also take me down and affect me and my children as well. And so there are some risks that you just have to take because the other ones are infinitely larger. Right? Thank you for the question. Yeah.
How much of the problem is racism, and then how much of the problem is greed and neo-colonialism, the desire to, make profit?
It's 100% both. I think it's, I think about it in that framework. I think that white supremacy has needed capitalism to survive, and capitalism has needed white supremacy to survive, right? When you think about it in strictly Marxist terms, and I'm not strictly speaking a Marxist, but if you think about it in strictly Marxist terms, he talked about, this notion that people have false consciousness, right? That workers, the reason they don't rise up and change the system is they have false consciousness because the system dangles, little baubles out and says, here, you can have some opportunity too, et cetera, but that you don't really have a consciousness of yourself as a class until a certain period of time goes by, and then eventually it'll happen. The problem is that whiteness has been a transmission belt for false consciousness. So that when white folks are offered advantages relative to other people of different quote-unquote racial groups, it gives them a sense that they have a stake in the system, that they really don't, but it's enough to keep them in line. And the only way that we're going to undo the class inequality that exists in this country is if we talk about that directly. And there are a lot of people who like to talk about capitalism or colonialism or neoliberalism, but don't like to talk about white supremacy. In fact, they'll say things like, well, that's a distraction, we should just talk about class. But you can't just talk about class. You have, because the class system is being kept in place by the racialized system and by misogyny and a lot of other things. We have to talk about all of them in an intersectional way. We have to talk about the way that all of these things feed on one another. So it's 100% the quest for profit, because that obviously has a huge impact on the way that we view resources over which we are fighting, right? If we weren't in this war for resources with one another under a system of greed and profit and neoliberalism and neocolonialism, then perhaps white supremacy wouldn't have the same effect it does. But because we are, those two things create this sort of toxic combination. And as a result, we find ourselves in the place that we are. So we need to have an anti-racism that is also class conscious. We need an anti-capitalism that is race and color conscious. We need both of those things to be conscious of misogyny and patriarchy. We need all of those things to be conscious of heterosexism and transphobia and all the systemic injustices that face people on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. We need all of that in the mix, or we're never going to get out of this problem. And just again, on a practical level, the more that we talk about all of the ingredients, the bigger the coalition is. Right? It doesn't make any sense to just do anti-racism without the rest, because now you've basically, ignored other potential allies in the struggle. It doesn't make any sense to just fight heterosexism and transphobia without an anti-racist lens, because then you've limited yourself there. It doesn't make any sense to just fight patriarchy and not fight the class system, because then you've cut, all of these things have to be part of our framework. And I think they're all under attack right now, which is a really good example, right? Because this administration isn't just going after DEIA because of race. They're going after it because of the potential empowerment of women as women. They're going after it because they want to erase LGBTQ folk from the conversation, especially trans folk entirely, and non-binary folk from the conversation. And they're going after working people. So all of the things that make up the diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility conversation are in their crosshairs. And the only way we get out of it is to make coalition between all of those folks. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey there. I have two older siblings who have both graduated with degrees in library technology. They're both happy to work in California, where book bans are thankfully not all too common, but many of their colleagues are not. They have confided to me recently that they are unsure what to tell them, that they feel hopeless
Yeah.
sometimes reading and seeing and hearing about things that would happen south side, east side, all over the country really. My question would be in two parts for you, sir. Do you think legislation or community consensus is the best path forward? And is there a contemporary example of overturning a book ban that you think is a good model to study?
So I think when it comes to book bans and censorship, obviously it is important, and all of the attacks on learning and knowledge and the right to learn, the right to read, the right to imbibe information, it is important when possible to have policy in place. But there are times when even having a policy in place isn't going to be sufficient to prevent the assault. I mean, right now, technically, we have a First Amendment. That's a policy of a sort. It's in place, and it tells us that these things are flatly illegal. Now, there are cases working their way through courts right now where that argument is being made, and my guess is, even with the courts as captured as they are by reactionaries who I don't trust as far as I can throw, I still nonetheless believe that these assaults are likely, in most cases, to be stopped, because they are such blatant attacks on the First Amendment. And the one area in which the court has been relatively consistent, even among some of its more conservative members, is on free speech issues. Sometimes I think for cynical reasons, but nonetheless, that's sort of the precedent here. And so my guess is that when these cases make their way through, a lot of that stuff will be stopped. Now, here's the caveat to that. There is also a certain degree of legal precedent which says, and this is very troubling, that schools are technically, and employees of schools, like teachers, professors, librarians, etc., if it's a public institution in particular, that they are, in that moment when doing their job, sort of like agents of the state. Now, I think that's a really questionable idea, but that's something the courts have said. And that as a result, teachers don't really have, in public institutions, and librarians certainly don't, have full First Amendment rights on the job. They do privately, they can post whatever they want on social media, etc., but in the context of doing their job, the state actually can, or the federal government, if there's federal money tied to that institution, does have a certain degree of leeway to limit on a state-by-state or community-by-community basis what can be said. It's a ridiculous precedent, but there it is, and it does exist. So there may be attempts, even with the First Amendment, to limit what can be taught. So that brings us back to the community involvement and really changing the narrative. The policy is important, but I think more important is galvanizing the public to be as militant in favor of the right to read, the right to learn, the right to access information as those who are wanting to censor are militant, right? So if they're showing up at school board meetings, at Moms for Liberty or whatever the hell, and demanding this book needs to be taken off the shelves because it's turning our babies trans or whatever the hell, or this book needs to be taken off the shelves because it makes little Susie upset about racism to learn that white people once did this thing to black people. My God, we can't do that. If they're going to show up and demand the removal of those books, we have to be showing up to demand their inclusion. And a lot of times we don't. What we do is we post on social and we express our outrage with a tweet or an Instagram post, but they show up, man. They show up and they never punch the clock to check out. Like, they're always on the job. And a lot of times we're afraid to be as militant. We're like, oh my God, we don't want to go and have them yell at us. Well, but they don't mind yelling. So at some point you have to show up and tell lawmakers, tell school boards, tell the principal of a particular school, tell the state legislature or city council or whatever it is that you're as adamant as the other side is. And I don't know of any examples of legislation per se that has stopped this, but I will say I have seen some incredible organizing done. There was early on when this book banning really took off at the end of the first Trump administration, beginning of the Biden administration, but it was even with Biden in office on the state level, dozens of states were banning books, right? In York, Pennsylvania, there was an attempt, for instance, to remove all these books from York High School, I guess, or whatever the main high school is up there. And they were trying to take away books that dealt with LGBTQ folks, with racism, all these issues. And the students organized, right? They organized to demand that those books get put back. I think that's where we need to start, because young people in particular, even young people that don't share like really progressive or left politics, one thing that young people, just by definition, based on age alone, don't like is being told what they can and cannot read. Like, young people hate censorship, right? Like, my God, you're telling me I can't read it? That makes me want to read it. That's the mentality of anyone that's 15, right? And so we should work with that. If that's the 15-year-old's thinking, then we should work with that 15 and say, well, then you need to get your other 15-year-old friends together and demand that and make the case in front of the school board and shame the school board or shame the principal or shame whoever it is for wanting to move in the other direction. They got those books put back. Recently at the Naval Academy, a little bit different, but that Pete Hegseth, as Secretary of Defense, decided to pull 400 books from the shelves of the Naval Academy because I guess that these are, future midshipmen that can go to war, but they can't read books. That's too frightening for them. So they pulled 400 books, including 4 of mine. I was actually the most banned author at the Naval Academy for about, yeah, I know, I'm very proud of it. Thank you, I appreciate that. The most banned author at the Naval Academy. And now, but here's the thing. Even though he didn't rescind his order to remove those books, a graduate of the Naval Academy who had been a midshipman or whatever, I think that's what they're called, right? The graduate of the Naval Academy was so offended by the decision to censor these books that he decided to start a fund to buy the books, worked with a local bookstore in Annapolis to get the books first in the bookstore and then put back on the shelves of the Naval Academy. So we have the ability to stand up to these bullies, sometimes with public policy, but mostly, I think, with just the logic and the outrage that young people in particular feel. And when they talk about parents' rights, we need to do this because of parents' rights. Like, which parents? What about the parents who want their kids to learn about the things that you don't want them to learn about? What about the parents, you say parents' rights, well, do you mean the parents of trans children? The parents of queer children? The parents of black children? The parents of Latino children? Clearly you don't mean them, because you're erasing them from the narrative. So we need to be able to stand up and demand, yeah, we believe in the rights of parents. You can raise your kid however, you want to raise your kid to believe that God created the earth in 6 literal days on a Gregorian calendar that didn't even exist yet. You can tell your kids whatever manner of codswallop you want, but that doesn't mean that you get to tell my kids the same thing and expect them to buy it. They have a right to their education, just like your kids have a right to whatever you want to teach them. And I think that with that as a movement imperative, more than a policy imperative, will probably get further. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, interestingly, that will actually help us get better policy too. But I think it starts with public pressure, for sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that was perfect. It is now 3:30 and we are out of time. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.